Welcome to the very first Dialed In webcast. I'm Allan Gray, Executive Director of the Digital Innovation and Agri-Food Systems Lab, or what we call Dial Ventures at Purdue University, a startup studio dedicated to advancing the food and ag system through digital innovation. Today, I've got Elliott Parker with me, our key partner from High Alpha Innovation in Indianapolis, an opportunity to visit with him a little bit about the concept of startup studios, why we need them, what that means for us in this ag tech and food tech space. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to really dig in with Elliott a little bit about these sorts of things. So Elliott, tell me a little bit about High Alpha Innovation. What is High Alpha Innovation? How did it come about?
Sure. And Allan, thanks for having me as the first guest too. Really excited about this and look forward to see this podcast develop. So High Alpha Innovation is a venture builder. We co-create what we call advantaged startups to solve compelling problems. And co-create means we build startups with universities and with corporations and world-class entrepreneurs. Advantage startups means we build startups that are embedded with some type of advantage, endowed with some type of advantage that enables them to succeed in the market, to get to bigger outcomes faster than they would otherwise. And compelling problems. We're looking for really important problems that we can direct this amazing engine of the startup at. Startups are fantastic at learning, and when properly incentivized, setup can solve really important, meaningful problems. So we're looking for really big problems, really big opportunities, and there are a lot of those in the agri-food system.
Fantastic. So Elliott, tell me a little bit about Elliott Parker. What's your path? How did you end up in this space where you're building these advantage startups?
Yeah, well, passion for entrepreneurship is where it starts, and also a passion for innovation and seeing organizations like corporations and universities get better at addressing some of the big problems that face humanity. It's what we do at High Alpha Innovations, the merger of those two things. My background is in corporate innovation, corporate venture capital, startups. Tech transfer is where I began my career a long, long time ago. Spent many years working with at the consulting firm founded by Clayton Christensen, who is the late Harvard Business School professor who came up with the theory of disruptive innovation and taught the world about this idea of the innovator's dilemma. The challenge all big companies face, they'll do everything right, ultimately still fail because of the way that incentives work. They leave themselves open to disruption on the low end. The solution to that dilemma is to go build new ventures apart from the core, and that's what we do at High Alpha Innovation. We take the playbook we developed at High Alpha Venture Studio, launched 8 years ago in Indianapolis, and we make that playbook accessible to partners, corporations, universities, so that we can go build more startups than we could on our own. We believe the world needs more entrepreneurs and more of them to succeed. And so we're on a mission to do that, and along the way solve some really big problems.
Great, Elliott. So this idea of when you were working with Clayton Christensen, working at InnoSite, I find that fascinating. By the way, I'm a bit of a disciple, although I didn't get to work with him directly like you did. I'm a bit jealous. I've read probably everything he ever wrote in the space around this whole idea of disruptive innovation. And you really, I think it was about 2019, I watched you make a presentation. It might have been 2020, if I recall correctly, but you talked about this concept of peak centralization and really kind of got into this. I think this idea really was started probably with the work that Clayton Christensen did, the work y'all did at InnoSite, that something about this idea of the corporations want to be innovative but struggle. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing that. Can you tell me more about this idea of peak centralization? What does that look like?
Yeah, and here's where we'll test the mettle of your audience by going deep into a topic that you and I both find really interesting. I hope they do too. But we are, and I think in a moment, a shift is going on. A shift is underway in the way the world works, actually, in the way that people collaborate to solve important problems. It's a shift driven in large part by advances in technology, access to communication. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. But if you look at the last kind of a broad span of time, if you look across the last few hundred years at the history of the corporation, one of the greatest inventions in the history of mankind, this idea of limited liability corporation, the idea that you can get people together and out of thin air create promises, essentially, in terms of how we're going to act together, set up a system of incentives that will lead people to do amazing things, like build the laptops that we're using to talk to each other on right now. Corporation's an incredible invention, and it didn't have to happen. It's kind of a miracle that it did. But if you look at the history over the last few hundred years, how corporations evolved, over time, corporations realize that they succeed by bringing resources and assets into the wall of the corporation. Back in the early 20th century, Ronald Coase won a Nobel Prize for explaining why corporations exist. And what he said was, corporations exist to bring those assets and resources into the corporation, to manage the transactions between them, and to manage those transactions at a lower cost than they could if they were acting out in the open market. That lower cost, the delta, is profit inside a corporation. Now, what happens when the world changes and those costs of transactions can actually be done for less of a cost outside the corporation than previously they were done internally inside? That's where the world we're in right now. In many cases, those transactions, access to knowledge, expertise, the buying and selling of different parts or services that was done cheaply inside a corporation before can now be done less expensively out in the open market. And as a result, we're in a moment where we're kind of questioning, well, why do corporations exist now? And should we be thinking about new forms of corporation, so on. Anyway, I think we're at a point where we saw this kind of drive to centralization, power being happening inside the walls of corporations. The peak may have been the 1950s. For me, it's the mental models AT&T and Bell Labs. You had over 1 million people working at AT&T before it was broken up. At Bell Labs, you had one of the most outstanding examples of corporate innovation ever. They could bring in the world's foremost experts in a technology area and do things like invent vacuum tubes and modern computing, electronics. We're unlikely to see anything like that happen inside a big corporation ever again, because again, technology has improved, specifically computing power, which enables more people to access information, to act as experts, to access expertise, to do things that previously they couldn't have done very easily on their own. Similarly, communication enables more sharing of ideas, more sharing of the technology building blocks at a faster pace. We can talk to anyone in the world for free anytime we want. That's never happened before in the history of humanity. And those changes empower individuals and small teams more than ever before, in my view. And so corporations are now at a point where you've got to find new ways to engage in this world where innovation is going to happen a lot faster than it used to.
So one of the things I find interesting about, maybe I would just say it this way, Elliott, maybe I'm not exactly 100% with you in the sense that I think the corporation may be going the way of the horse and buggy. I'm not sure about that, but potentially. But I will say, my work for all of my career in business strategy, really working mostly with incumbents and thinking a little bit about how do we develop strategy. The concepts of strategy that often lead to success in the company also have a tendency to lead to an inability to innovate in the disruptive space that you're talking about, right? So I think about it, and in fact, I think Clayton Christensen wrote about this, right? That one of the challenges is that as a company, as a corporation grows and becomes more successful, it collects those resources, as you suggested, it develops a set of processes, and it begins to codify its value systems.
Yeah.
Once it does that, the idea that I might need to innovate in some way that might break that value system or completely change the processes needed, or maybe even require a different set of resources, suddenly means the things that make this corporation successful also make it so that it can't really innovate in those ways. And I don't think that's to say that corporations can't be innovative. That they are. They do create new stuff, but what is it that Christian would have called, Clayton would have called it sustaining innovations.
That's
They
right.
tend to be really good at things mostly like product development, line extensions, because they utilize the resources, the processes, the values that have been put in place that allow them to be successful. Those things don't get shifted or disrupted. Sorry to use the word disrupt, but they don't get disrupted by sustaining innovations. It's these things you're talking about where technology really sort of changes the rules of the game. That can often be difficult for a corporation. Are we on the same page of
Yeah,
that? Or
that's right. Yeah, no, corporations aren't going away, and thank goodness for that. Actually, there are only certain problems that I think corporations, people collaborating inside of corporations, can address. Startups are limited in what they can do. Corporations are a powerful tool for solving important problems. But what I am saying is that it's going to be harder. It's going to become increasingly difficult for corporations to endure, meaning the level of a specific corporation. We're seeing the lifespans of companies shrink over the last few decades, and the trend continues. Those numbers are going to go down. Some of my former colleagues did some research to look at the lifespan of your average company on the S&P 500 to find that along 60, 70 years ago, when a company was put on the S&P 500, it would typically stay there for 60 years. And if I'm remembering the numbers right, in the last decade, that's dropped to 20 years, and the trend going further down, where we should expect that over the course of 15 years, you might see half the S&P 500 swap out because they're not able to stay ahead of the pace of innovation. They're not able to innovate faster than the market. It's harder to innovate than it once was for these large organizations. And you explain exactly why. Organizations are very good at sustaining, large corporations are very good at sustaining innovations. Most of the things that we see and enjoy that make the world the way they are sustaining innovations. There's a place for that. It's a really important part of what corporations do. The problem is luck runs out at a certain point, and those disruptors come up and take out those incumbents. Sustaining innovation is not an enduring strategy in its own. Organizations, large corporations also have to figure out how to do those things that are more transformative that the disruptors are otherwise going to do.
well, as you said, you and I, we got to be careful. We can geek out on this topic, but I want to take it back to the concept of the startup because, Elliot, the interesting thing is, uh, unlike the basic startup world, the VC world, uh, even in some ways, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but relative to the standard startup studio, high alpha innovation has sort of taken an approach that says, well, rather than disrupting the corporations, why don't we
Yeah.
work with them?
Yeah.
And tell me what it is that you see about that. It says let's work with them and use the startup model as a way to help them with this challenge. How do you see that as opposed to saying why don't you just go create startups and just eliminate the corporations that won't be able to last anyway, right?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the world of venture capital and venture-backed startups. When people talk about that activity, it's most often framed as funding these companies that are going to disrupt the incumbents and take them out. And then when you look at what's actually viewed as a successful outcome, most of the time it's acquisition of that startup by one of those incumbents it was designed supposedly to take out. And so when we think about maybe how to improve the way that these things work, perhaps there's room in kind of the space of different approaches to consider that corporations and startups might partner together from the beginning, that we could actually build startups with those corporate partners in mind, with their problems in mind, with the problems of their customers, with the problems that they encounter in their ecosystem, not with the idea that we're going to take the big company out at some point, but that it's going to be a natural complement to what they're doing. We plan for that eventual acquisition, that story in mind from the beginning. And if we do that, we can, again, endow these startups with some advantage. You mentioned it well a second ago. Large corporations, as they scale, they all started as startups,
Right.
where they were trying to figure out and learn and figure out what worked. They found something that worked, and then they focused on scaling that and executing it really, really well. And as these large companies grow, Their model shifts, their processes and their systems are optimized for execution. They're not optimized for learning anymore. Learning at the margins, sure, sustainable types of innovation, right? Learning how to do things more efficiently, for example. That's what they do really, really well. They're optimized for safety, for preserving what's been built, for preserving the status quo. And so learning, innovating, specifically transformative innovation is by nature a capital inefficient activity because it requires making mistakes. You can't learn if you're not making mistakes. Big corporations are optimized to not make mistakes. Jack Welch famously said, variation is evil.
Right.
He's talking about big companies. And he's wrong. Now, I understand what he meant. We should try to make everything as predictable as we can. And that's a good inclination to a point, that there has to be an acceptable amount of variation even inside of big corporations, where that corporation's no longer learning. Now, startups, on the other hand, are incredibly inefficient from a capital perspective. They try all sorts of things to see what works. They're messy. You may look at startups. You haven't been involved in one. Those of you listening, you may look at some startups that you interact with as a customer, perhaps, and think, wow, they've got it all together. They've got it figured out. The reality is, I've never seen a startup that beneath the veneer is not in a constant state of panic. That's how startups work. They're incredibly capital inefficient. And the reason is that they're optimized for learning. They're actually optimized for mistake making so that they can figure out what works. And so if you can combine all the great things of a big corporation, that knowledge of the market, the access to customers, just the ability to do things at scale, with that learning ability of a startup, the ability of the startup to accept mistakes and inefficiency, if you can combine the best of both of those, in theory, everybody's better off. And that's kind of the hypothesis that we're testing at High Alpha Innovation.
Excellent. So, Elliott, one of the things that you've done also, in addition to working with individual corporations and trying to think about how can we help them innovate in ways that a startup can do that they can't, I think is brilliant. But you've also gone down a path of working with universities and thinking about this idea of developing startup studios with universities. What's the driving force behind that concept?
Yeah, universities are an amazing tool, and I think in many ways underutilized, actually, in terms of their potential, in terms of the impact that a university might have on the ecosystem in which it operates. And what I mean by that is universities are very good at generating ideas, forming connections. You see a lot of companies spinning out of universities. Far too many of those companies fail because that's not what a university's historically been designed to do. I remember having a conversation with a leader at a university once who explained that in the prior decade, they had launched over 100 startups from the university, which to me sounded incredibly impressive, until he told me how much revenue those startups had earned the prior year in total. And it was what we kind of came to the conclusion together was that the university was good at forming LLCs, not actually creating viable companies. And that's a shame because there's so much potential. And again, once you get to the point where a company's been formed and launched, that's just the starting line. And often in the way that universities work, it's viewed as the end product and kind of the metric by which we measure our success. It's really only the beginning. And so I think there are ways that we can use the power of the university as a convener in sourcing ideas, in developing solutions, and bringing together industry, capital, alumni, government, experts to make sure that when we launch companies, they're actually more likely to succeed than they would be if they were being launched out in the wild. So a university is uniquely positioned to go out and address really, really big, meaty, important challenges in a way that no other institution can. The trick is turning all that potential into benefits to those new companies that come out of the process, making sure that those companies are more likely to succeed. And that's where I'm super excited about the work that we're doing with universities, with Purdue in particular.
Yeah. So Elliott, I said this up front. We're partners here at Purdue University with you at High Alpha Innovation in Dial Ventures and what we do in Dial Ventures. And that work is really focused on ag tech and food tech and sort of really all along that vertical, if you will. I'm curious about, from High Alpha Innovations perspective, what was attractive about not necessarily working with Purdue? We can talk about that in a minute if you want to, but really this space. Why food and ag from your perspective?
Yeah, the short answer is just massive unsolved problems. And if you think about, we've got a lot of people to feed. Is there anything more critical than making sure humanity has the food that it needs over the next several decades? I can't think of a more important quest to make sure that our agri-food system is robust and up to the task. And when I think about, so you combine kind of the high level problem out there that we want to make sure we're collectively addressing. That's a really important problem. I think that there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of what technology can do in addressing some of the issues around how we feed people. A lot has been done. You go talk to your average grower, and they're almost drowning in technology and all the new things they're trying, experiments they're running, just amazing amount of innovation. But I think there's a lot more to do. I think there's a lot more opportunity up and down the supply chain. And that's what gets me really excited about the space. Here in Indiana, I think we've got this amazing kind of foundation of ag in terms of everywhere from growers to the big companies that are supporting them up and down the supply chain. And then we've got this amazing tech ecosystem here too. And we ought to be making, I think, this region the center of the universe when it comes to ag tech innovation. We've got all the resources here to be able to do it. So that gets us excited too. It's big problem, lots of untapped opportunities still. And then number three, we've got all the resources here in the region that we can pull together to do this. And at the heart of that, of course, is Purdue University, which sits at the confluence of industry, the alumni who are involved in these spaces, the research that's being done, the partnership with the government when it comes to research grants and things that are happening in the space as a land grant university. All of it is just, all the pieces are there to be brought together to go solve some really important problems.
So, and Elliott, we've been working on putting together the pieces of that puzzle to solve that problem. Not just putting them together. I should be a little more direct about that. Not only are we putting the piece of the puzzle together, but we've been doing it as we've been putting the piece of the puzzle together. I've said several times, you've heard me say this, let's fly this airplane while we're building it, which we've been doing a little bit of within Dial. But maybe without sounding too self-serving, I don't want you to just pat me on the back, but I do think it's important for our audience to hear, what does High Alpha Innovation see as the benefits of this partnership with Dial and the way I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think my perspective at least is we've been sort of building our own startup of creating startups, and so maybe tell the audience a little bit about, from your perspective, what it's been like to put that together and where you see the potential for this partnership between High Alpha Innovation and Dial specifically going.
Yeah, a startup that builds startups is very meta. Meaning, it's like talking about building the airplane as it's flying. If you're involved in just building a startup, that's one thing. It's hectic enough. If you're going to build a startup that's then going to build more startups, and you're going to do all of that at the same time within the context of a university, is another layer of complexity. It's not an easy thing, and so I think we collectively should be proud of the progress to date, and Allan, in particular, the work that you've done to get things this far. It's pretty amazing. Again, it's not intuitive or natural to understand that a university might have a role in actively building startups, for one thing. That's a proposition perhaps not everyone would even agree with. But it starts with that foundational belief that there can be impact through the vehicle of startups, and that university can be a good way to see them. I think that with Purdue in particular, what we see broadly with the folks that we interact with is a desire to explore the reaches to which a university can go. It's kind of the impact the university can have, and at its very core, what a university is even for in terms of its potential. And that's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And I think that Purdue, over the next decade, we'll see that Purdue really takes a lead role and is viewed widely as an example of what a university can do when it comes to having broad impact beyond the teaching and the research, but broad impact in solving real problems in the world, seeing those come to life
That's
of solutions.
that's great, Elliot. You know, our vision here is to have impact at scale. And how can we have impact
Yeah.
on our food and agricultural industry at scale? And our and its impact at scale, and it's both of those two words together that has always been the driving force behind what we're trying to do in Dial and our partnership with High Alpha Innovation is how can we really impact this industry, really help it innovate in ways that it struggles to do, particularly around digital stuff, and do that in a way that has real impact at scale. Our view is to bring the partnership of the industry together with us at Purdue and with High Alpha Innovation to create these startups with our fellows program to really have that sort of impact at scale. And I think we're headed down that path. My view is that we're headed down a really strong path here. As we've been building this airplane, we've done it. So we've created startup companies already. We have some strong positions already with startup companies coming out. I think Elliot, you and I actually had a chance to visit briefly this morning. You know, we just started a year ago, right? 2022 was our first year to start trying to do this stuff, and we've got two companies out, and maybe a third one coming out really quickly. I think that's really. They haven't gotten to an exit yet. So I'm always challenging us to say, remember, we're not about creating LLCs. We're actually about creating startups, as you said, that are going to be successful. But we're well on our path, and I'm excited about the opportunity there. Maybe just the last question I have for you, because I think the other thing that's a bit unique about our studio, and you've told me this before, we're maybe the first ones to try this. We have this fellows group that we attract 6 fellows from the industry every 6 months, and those industry fellows come in and they work with us in the studio in the development of the ideas that may or may not turn into a studio company. These fellows that are thinking about being entrepreneurs in the startup environment like we try to create here, maybe just from your perspective, what's the advice you would give to those folks that are thinking about this? Hey, I think I want to go on that path of creating a startup company.
Yeah, a great question. It's sure a fun position to be in for those fellows. There are times where I envy them and what they're doing, kind of the position of life where they are, where the world's their oyster in terms of the spaces they might jump into. I think about these fellows as the translators. I mean, this goes back to the opportunity for Dial, what Dial's doing that I think makes it so unique, and the opportunity for Purdue and other universities, frankly, that are thinking about it this way. Most of the commercialization, the impact that is done at universities is done from an inside-out perspective, where we're going to do research, we're going to come up with ideas, and we're going to take those out and see what the world needs. This model is different. It's outside in. Let's see what industry needs. Let's see what the problems are, and let's figure out how we can deploy the resources of the university to go address them. And those fellows are right at the crux of it. They're the translators. They're the ones who are working to figure out what the world needs, what the industry is saying the problems are, and then bringing that back to the university to say, okay, here's some things that we ought to go solve. And that's a key part of the program that differentiates it from your standard, what I see across most other, across a lot of other universities, where it's much more
That's
inside.
great, Elliot. That's the thing that I think you say to our fellows when we're together, and when I say it to them. One of the things that we do in this program is we get these entrepreneurial folks to understand that the critical element is to first fall in love with the problem. Too often I see too much, I have a solution, let me go see if I can find a problem for this particular solution. And I think that's the classic sort of startup and VC world actually has a tendency to have been that. We're turning that on its head and say, wait a minute, this is about the industry. It's about the problems they have and the challenges they have. Let's go fall in love with the problem. Then let's figure out the solution. See if we can create a startup company from that. I really fully buy into that concept and the way we do that and the way High Alpha Innovation has put together a playbook to help us really dig into figuring out how to fall in love with what that problem is.
Yeah, we want to savor surprises, right?
That's exactly right. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, Elliott Parker, CEO of High Alpha Innovation, has been with us today, sharing some insights around what it means really to have a startup studio that innovates for the industry. The strong partnership that we're creating with High Alpha Innovation and Dial is just fantastic from my perspective. I couldn't have had a better first guest. on. He's a brilliant man and very nice and quite handsome looking guy too. I was telling him just before this on the camera. So, Elliott, thank you for taking time to be with us today. Really enjoyed the conversation, and for the audience, please come back and join us again. I'm going to have guests on throughout that are guests from the industry, thinking about startups, thinking about ag tech, thinking about food tech. This is what we want to do with this particular webpage: is constantly be thinking about the kinds of things that are the future of where we're going in food and agriculture, and the way the startups may fit into that.